What would you do if you discovered that the ground beneath your feet had been silently keeping a secret for decades? A secret so disturbing that it would challenge everything you believed about your hometown, your neighbors, and perhaps even your own family. In the early spring of 1905, as the frost reluctantly released its grip on the rolling hills of Marion County, West Virginia, a discovery was made that would unsettle the quiet farming community of Fairmont for generations to come. What began as a routine expansion of an apple orchard on the old Blackwood property unearthed a truth so unsettling that many locals would later insist it should have remained buried alongside its victims. The Blackwood apple orchard had been a fixture of Marion County since 1868, established by Civil War veteran Thomas Blackwood upon his return from the bloody fields of Virginia. The orchard had flourished over the decades, its fruit renowned throughout the state for its exceptional sweetness. Local farmers attributed this quality to the rich, dark soil of the Blackwood property, soil that, as workers would discover, that fateful March morning, had been nourishing more than just apple trees for nearly 4 decades. "I've been digging holes for saplings most of my life," recalled Howard Jenkins, one of the laborers present that day, in a statement to the Fairmont Times. But nothing prepares a man for finding something like that, the way they were positioned. Like they'd been arranged, their hands still clasped together after all those years. It wasn't natural, wasn't right. The they Jenkins referred to were the remains of 2 young women, later identified as Sarah and Emily Prescott, sisters who had disappeared from the neighboring town of Mannington in 1867. The sisters, aged 19 and 17 at the time of their disappearance, had been the subject of what was then the largest search effort in the county's history. Their discovery, nearly 4 decades later, raised more questions than it answered. Questions that would lead investigators down a path few were prepared to follow. County Sheriff William Harrison, approaching retirement after 27 years of service, found himself suddenly thrust into what would become the most perplexing case of his career. The initial facts were strange enough. 2 sisters, buried in a shallow grave, their skeletal hands still intertwined with no apparent cause of death. But it was what the workers found buried with them that truly set the community on edge. The items recovered from the burial site suggest ritual significance, noted Dr. Lawrence Pemberton, a professor of anthropology from West Virginia University, who was called in to consult on the case. The arrangement of the bodies, the unusual artifacts, and the apparent care taken in the burial all point to something far more complex than a simple murder. Among the artifacts recovered were several small cloth pouches containing what appeared to be bird bones, dried herbs, and small stones with strange markings etched into their surfaces. A tarnished silver locket was found between the sisters' skeletal remains, containing a lock of hair that did not match either victim. Most disturbing of all was a small leather-bound book recovered from beneath Sarah Prescott's remains, its pages filled with writings in a language no one in Fairmont could identify. "I've been sheriff in this county since 1878, Harrison was quoted saying in his official report. "Never in all my years have I encountered anything like this. Those girls were laying there, holding hands, looking peaceful-like." But there was something wrong about the whole scene. Something in the air around that grave that made the hairs on your neck stand up. My deputy, young Collins, he wouldn't even step into that hole to help recover the evidence, said he felt something watching him from the trees. The discovery quickly captured the attention of newspapers across West Virginia and neighboring states. The Wheeling Intelligencer ran a front-page story titled "Mannington Mystery, Cursed Sisters Found After 38 Years," while the Pittsburgh Gazette devoted nearly 2 full pages to what they dubbed the Orchard Grave Enigma. Public fascination with the case grew as details, often embellished, spread throughout the region. For the residents of Marion County, however, the discovery was far from a mere curiosity. Many of the older citizens remembered the Prescott sisters and the circumstances surrounding their disappearance, circumstances that had divided the community decades earlier and would soon resurface to haunt a new generation. The Prescott family had arrived in Mannington in 1865, shortly after the conclusion of the Civil War. Jacob Prescott, a widower with 2 daughters, had purchased a modest property on the outskirts of town and established himself as a watchmaker of considerable skill. By all accounts, Prescott was a reserved but respected member of the community, known for the precision of his work and his devotion to his daughters. Jacob Prescott kept to himself mostly, recalled Eleanor Whitman, 87 at the time, of the discovery, who had been a childhood friend of Emily Prescott. But those girls, they were different, beautiful in a way that wasn't quite right. Sarah had these eyes that seemed to look straight through you, and Emily always seemed to know things before they happened. Folks were wary, but the girls were so sweet-natured, it was hard to hold their strangeness against them. This strangeness Whitman alluded to was a common theme in recollections of the Prescott sisters. In the months following their disappearance in 1867, rumors had circulated about unusual occurrences associated with the girls. Some claimed to have seen them walking through the woods at night, whispering to the trees. Others spoke of their uncanny ability to predict coming storms or deaths in the community. "My grandmother told me stories about those girls," said Thomas. Finch, proprietor of Finch's General Store in 1905, said that in the weeks before they vanished, livestock started dying all around town. Chickens, goats, even a couple of prize horses. All found with no marks on them, just dead in their pens come morning. And every time an animal died, someone would spot one of those Prescott girls nearby, just watching with those strange eyes of theirs. Such accounts, dismissed as superstition by Sheriff Harrison and other officials, nonetheless persisted in the oral history of Marion County. The discovery of the sisters' remains brought these old tales back to the surface, along with witnesses who had remained silent for decades. Among these was Reverend Josiah Campbell, who in 1905 was nearing his 90th year. Campbell had been the minister at Mannington Baptist Church when the Prescotts arrived in 1865. In a sworn statement given to Sheriff Harrison, the elderly clergyman revealed information he claimed to have kept secret for nearly 40 years. "I knew there was something unnatural about those girls from the moment they set foot in my church," Campbell's statement read. "There was a darkness that followed them, a shadow that had nothing to do with the sun. I confronted Jacob Prescott about it once, told him I sensed something unwholesome in his daughters. He didn't deny it. Instead, he told me they were special and that I wouldn't understand, said they had inherited a gift from their mother's side." According to Campbell, Jacob Prescott had confided that his late wife, Abigail, had come from a family in Massachusetts with a complicated history. Though Prescott never elaborated on this history, Campbell claimed to have later discovered that Abigail's maternal ancestors had fled Salem in 1692, at the height of the witch trials there. "I didn't make the connection until after the girls disappeared," Campbell continued. "But once I did, things began to make a terrible kind of sense. The strange occurrences around town, the livestock deaths, the way crops would wither when the girls passed by certain fields. And then there were the dreams." The dreams, Campbell referred to, were reported by several Mannington residents in the spring of 1867. These individuals, unconnected except for their proximity to the Prescott home, all described experiencing vivid nightmares in which they saw the sisters walking hand in hand through an orchard, the trees bearing fruit that wept blood when plucked. "I dismissed these accounts as hysteria at the time," Sheriff Harrison admitted in his report. "But in light of where the bodies were discovered, I find myself revisiting these testimonies with newfound concern. Indeed, the location of the sisters' burial in what would later become the Blackwood apple orchard added another layer of disquiet to an already disturbing case. According to county records, Thomas Blackwood had purchased the land in 1868, just 1 year after the Prescott sisters' disappearance. Before Blackwood's acquisition, the property had been unoccupied woodland, owned by the county, and considered unsuitable for farming due to the rocky, difficult terrain. That land was thought to be worthless, noted county historian Margaret Wilkins in 1905. Everyone was surprised when Blackwood bought it, and even more surprised when his orchard thrived where nothing had grown before. Some said he had a special touch with plants, but others whispered that the land had somehow changed overnight, that the soil had turned dark and rich, for reasons no one could explain. These whispers took on new significance in light of the discovery, particularly when investigators learned that Thomas Blackwood and Jacob Prescott had served in the same regiment during the Civil War. Though no record existed of a friendship between the two men, the connection raised questions about Blackwood's role in the sisters' fate. Unfortunately, Thomas Blackwood had passed away in 1893, taking whatever knowledge he possessed to his grave. His son, Charles Blackwood, who had inherited the orchard, claimed no knowledge of the bodies on his property or any connection between his father and the Prescott family. "My father was a good Christian man who built something from nothing," Charles Blackwood insisted in an interview with the Fairmont Times. These insinuations are nothing short of slander against a decorated veteran who can no longer defend himself. "If those poor girls are buried on our land, it was without my father's knowledge. This whole business is bringing a curse upon my family that we don't deserve." Charles Blackwood's mention of a curse would prove unfortunately prescient. In the weeks following the discovery, a series of misfortunes befell those connected to the investigation. Deputy Collins, who had refused to enter the gravesite, was thrown from his horse while patrolling the northern county line, suffering a broken neck that left him paralyzed. Dr. Pemberton developed a mysterious illness after examining the artifacts found with the bodies, an illness characterized by high fever and disturbing hallucinations that eventually required his hospitalization. Most troubling were the reports from the workers who had discovered the remains. 3 of the 5 men involved experienced vivid nightmares in which they claimed the Prescott sisters visited them, still holding hands, their eyes replaced by writhing masses of worms. 2 of these men abruptly left Marion County, leaving no forwarding address. The third, Howard Jenkins, was found dead in his home 2 weeks after the discovery, his body unmarked save for an expression of extreme terror frozen on his face. "The doctor says it was his heart," Jenkins' widow told Sheriff Harrison. "But that doesn't explain why every mirror in our house shattered that night, or why I found him clutching that strange little stone in his hand, the one with the marking on it that looks like an eye." The stone Mrs. Jenkins referred to was identical to those found in the cloth pouches buried with the sisters, stones that had been secured as evidence and locked in the sheriff's office. How Jenkins came to possess one remains unexplained. These incidents, combined with the already unusual nature of the case, led to widespread anxiety throughout Marion County. Church attendance surged as residents sought spiritual protection. Parents forbade their children from venturing near the Blackwood property. Sales of protective charms and talismans reached unprecedented levels at local markets. Sheriff Harrison, a pragmatic man with little patience for superstition, struggled to maintain order while pursuing what little concrete evidence existed. His investigation led him to explore the fate of Jacob Prescott, who had left Mannington shortly after his daughter's disappearance. According to records uncovered by Harrison, Prescott had relocated to Baltimore, Maryland, where he continued his trade as a watchmaker until his death in 1884. His death certificate listed the cause as melancholia leading to self-destruction, suicide. Among his personal effects was found a letter addressed to his daughters, never sent, in which he begged their forgiveness for an unspecified transgression. "I cannot bear the weight of what I've done," Prescott wrote. "The bargain was not worth the cost. If there is mercy in the hereafter, I pray we will not meet there, for I could not face your accusation even in eternity. The fruit of our sin continues to grow, and I fear the harvest is only beginning." This cryptic message, combined with the unusual circumstances of the sisters' burial, led Sheriff Harrison to expand his investigation beyond Marion County. Correspondence with authorities in Massachusetts confirmed that Abigail Prescott's maternal family, the Osborns, had indeed fled Salem during the witch trials. More disturbing was the discovery that similar cases had occurred in other locations, where descendants of the Osborn family had settled. In 1829, the town of Millfield, Ohio, had experienced a series of unexplained deaths following the arrival of Mary Osborn and her twin daughters. In 1851, 2 sisters with the surname Bishop, later confirmed to be Osborn descendants, had disappeared from their home in Carterville, Illinois, only for their bodies to be discovered decades later buried in an orchard, their hands clasped together. "The pattern is unmistakable," wrote Professor Elijah Monroe of Miskatonic University, a scholar of folk traditions whom Harrison had consulted. "These occurrences follow a specific lineage, always manifesting in pairs of sisters. The orchard connection is particularly significant, as trees have long been considered conduits between worlds in various mystical traditions. I strongly advise caution in the handling of any artifacts recovered from the burial site, as they may serve as anchors for influences beyond our understanding." Harrison, though skeptical of Monroe's more esoteric warnings, nevertheless took precautions with the evidence in his possession. The leather-bound book found with the sisters was secured in a locked box after several deputies complained of hearing whispers when in its presence. The cloth pouches and marked stones were similarly isolated after a clerk reported that they seemed to rearrange themselves when left unattended overnight. Despite these measures, strange phenomena continued to plague those involved in the case. The photographer hired to document the burial site, and evidence discovered that his plates showed bizarre distortions, shadows where none should exist, and spectral figures among the trees of the orchard. The transcriptionist taking witness statements found her notes altered between sessions, with unknown symbols appearing in the margins of her pages. Most alarming was the condition of the Blackwood orchard itself. In the month following the discovery, the trees, which had been preparing to bloom, instead began to wither. Their bark darkened and split, seeping a reddish sap that local farmers swore smelled of blood. The spring crop failed entirely, with blossoms blackening on the branch before falling away like ash. Charles Blackwood, facing financial ruin, made a desperate decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Against the advice of Sheriff Harrison and Reverend Campbell's successor at the Mannington Baptist Church, Blackwood arranged for the reburial of the Prescott sisters in the town cemetery, hoping this would lift whatever curse had befallen his orchard. The reburial ceremony, held at dusk on April 23, 1905, was attended by a small group of officials and curious onlookers. As the simple pine coffin containing the sisters' remains was lowered into its new grave, witnesses reported an abrupt change in weather, the clear spring evening suddenly overcome by a bone-chilling cold. "It wasn't natural, that cold," stated Margaret Collins, who had attended the ceremony. "It cut straight through to your soul, like winter reaching up from the grave itself." And then there were the birds. The birds Collins referred to were a flock of crows that descended on the cemetery just as the first shovelful of dirt hit the coffin. Hundreds of the blackbirds swarmed overhead, their cries drowning out the minister's words before they settled in the surrounding trees, watching the proceedings with an intelligence that many found disturbing. "Those weren't just birds," Collins insisted. "They were watching us, judging us. And when it was done, when the grave was filled, they didn't fly away. They followed us. Every person who attended that burial found crows perched outside their windows that night, staring in. My husband, he shot at them, but they wouldn't scatter. They just watched like they were waiting for something. Whatever the crows might have been waiting for apparently came that night. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, residents near the cemetery were awakened by what many described as a woman's scream, but wrong somehow. Those brave enough to look outside reported seeing 2 female figures in white moving among the headstones, hand in hand, their faces obscured by the darkness. By morning, the newly dug grave of the Prescott sisters had been disturbed, the earth thrown aside, the coffin splintered open and empty. No trace of the skeletal remains was found, despite an extensive search of the cemetery and surrounding areas. The only evidence that anything had occurred was a series of small footprints leading from the grave to the cemetery gate, where they abruptly vanished. "They've gone back to the orchard," declared Reverend Isaiah Fleming, who had conducted the reburial service. "That's where they're bound, where the bargain was made. The removal disturbed something that should have been left alone. God help us all for what might follow." Fleming's words proved prophetic. The morning after the disappearance of the remains, workers at the Blackwood orchard arrived to find the withered trees suddenly restored to health, their branches heavy with blossoms, despite the fact that the spring blooming season had nearly passed. Within weeks, the trees bore fruit, apples of unprecedented size and a deep crimson color that had never been seen in the orchard before. Charles Blackwood, seeing his fortunes reversed, eagerly harvested this unusual crop and brought it to market. The apples sold quickly, their remarkable sweetness and unique color making them highly sought after, despite their unseasonable appearance. Only later would the consequences of this harvest become apparent. Herd started with dreams, reported Dr. Samuel Winters, the county physician. Everyone who consumed those apples began experiencing the same dream. Two young women, walking through an endless orchard, beckoning them to follow deeper among the trees. Then came the physical symptoms, heightened senses, particularly smell and taste, a persistent sensation of being watched, and most concerning, a compulsion to visit the Blackwood property. This compulsion led to a strange pilgrimage, as dozens of Marion County residents began making nightly journeys to the orchard. They came alone or in small groups, walking as if in a trance to stand beneath the red-fruited trees until dawn broke. When questioned about these excursions, many claimed no memory of leaving their homes, while others spoke of receiving instructions from the Prescott sisters in their dreams. Sheriff Harrison, increasingly concerned by these developments but lacking any legal grounds for intervention, placed the orchard under surveillance. His deputies reported that the nightly visitors would stand motionless among the trees for hours, occasionally swaying in unison or speaking in hushed voices. Most disturbing were reports that some visitors appeared to engage in conversations with unseen presences, nodding and gesturing as if responding to questions or commands that only they could hear. As May turned to June, the situation escalated further. Children from families that had consumed the crimson apples began to exhibit unusual behaviors. They collected small bones and stones, fashioning pouches identical to those found with the sisters' remains. They drew strange symbols on doors and windows, symbols that matched those etched into the stones from the burial site. In their games, they sang rhymes about the sisters who walk through the trees and the fruit that feeds on more than sun. Harrison, recognizing that the situation had moved beyond conventional law enforcement, reluctantly sought outside assistance. His inquiries eventually led him to Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a researcher from Johns Hopkins University who specialized in what she termed folkloric epidemics, outbreaks of unusual behavior that spread through communities like contagion. Morgan arrived in Fairmont on June 12, 1905, and immediately began documenting the phenomena associated with the Prescott case. Her methodical approach and scientific demeanor initially reassured local officials, but her conclusions would ultimately offer little comfort. What we are witnessing in Marion County is not mass hysteria in the traditional sense, Morgan wrote in her preliminary report. The consistency of the experiences, the physical manifestations, and the clear progression of effects all point to something more structured than mere suggestion. There is an organizing intelligence behind these events, something using the collective consciousness of this community as a medium for expression, or perhaps manifestation. Morgan's investigation took a more urgent turn when the first death occurred. Thomas Finch, the general store proprietor who had shared his grandmother's stories about the Prescott sisters, was found in the orchard on the morning of June 15th. His body lay beneath the largest of the apple trees, his eyes open and fixed on the branches above, his expression one of rapturous terror. The cause of death was determined to be heart failure, but the circumstances, and the fact that his mouth was filled with half-chewed apple pulp that matched the crimson fruit, suggested something more sinister. Finch's death was followed by others, all individuals who had consumed the crimson apples and subsequently participated in the nightly vigils at the orchard. Each was found in the same position, beneath the trees with the same expression and the same evidence of having eaten the fruit shortly before death. By the end of June, 7 residents of Marion County had perished in this manner. Public panic reached a breaking point. Demands for action led Charles Blackwood to agree to the destruction of his orchard, a decision he reportedly made after waking to find his bedroom walls covered in handprints that appeared to have been made with apple pulp mixed with what later testing suggested was human blood. On July 3, 1905, a controlled burn of the Blackwood orchard was attempted. Witnesses described how the flames, upon reaching the trees, burned with an unusual purple hue and produced smoke that formed distinct shapes as it rose, shapes that many claimed resembled 2 female figures holding hands. Most disturbing were the sounds that emanated from the burning orchard, Sounds described variously as women laughing, children singing, or many voices whispering in unison. The fire, despite being set under optimal conditions and supervised by experienced firefighters, extinguished itself before completing its work. Only a third of the orchard was destroyed, with the largest and most productive trees, those bearing the crimson apples, remaining untouched, their fruit unblemished despite the heat and smoke. This inexplicable outcome led Dr. Morgan to propose a more radical solution. Having studied the leather-bound book found with the sisters' remains, she had determined that while the language was unknown, certain passages appeared to be incantations or rituals related to binding and containment. With the reluctant assistance of Reverend Fleming, Morgan developed what she termed a counter-ritual designed to address the supernatural elements of the case. "I approach this not as a believer in the occult," Morgan clarified in her notes, "but as a scientist recognizing patterns and testing hypotheses. If these events follow folkloric rules, and all evidence suggests they do, then there must be a procedure for their resolution. Every curse has its countermeasure, every haunting its banishment. It is simply a matter of determining the correct formula." The formula Morgan devised required items from both Christian and older traditions: consecrated earth from 7 churches, silver nails forged during a new moon, and water from a spring that had never seen sunlight. Most crucial was the participation of 7 women descended from the original Salem families, women who might share whatever gift had manifested in the Prescott sisters. Finding such participants proved challenging, as many families had changed their names or hidden their Salem connections due to lingering stigma. Eventually, through genealogical research and discreet inquiries, 7 women of the required lineage were identified and persuaded to travel to Marion County. Their arrival in early August was met with both hope and trepidation by a community desperate for resolution. The ritual was scheduled for August 12th, the night of a lunar eclipse that Morgan believed would weaken whatever forces were at work in the orchard. Preparations were made in secret, with only Sheriff Harrison, Dr. Morgan, Reverend Fleming, and the 7 women knowing the full details of what would transpire. On the appointed night, as the moon began to darken, the small group entered the orchard. The 7 women positioned themselves in a circle around the largest tree, the one beneath which most of the deaths had occurred. At the center stood Dr. Morgan and Reverend Fleming, the former holding the leather-bound book found with the sisters, the latter clutching his Bible and a vial of holy water. What happened next was witnessed only by those directly involved, as Harrison had established a perimeter to keep curious onlookers at a safe distance. According to the sheriff's official report, the ritual began with the women chanting words from the leather-bound book, their voices blending in what he described as an unsettling harmony that seemed to resonate with the very trees around us. As the eclipse reached totality, plunging the orchard into an unnatural darkness, witnesses reported seeing movement among the trees, shapes that appeared to be 2 young women, hand in hand, moving with unnatural speed between the trunks. The temperature dropped precipitously, frost forming on the grass despite the August heat. The apparitions seemed to become more substantial as the ritual progressed, Harrison noted. At first merely suggestions of forms, then increasingly defined until one could make out features, faces that shifted between youth and decay, flesh and bone. They moved with purpose toward the circle of women, their expressions first curious, then concerned, and finally, as they realized what was happening, furious. According to Harrison, the phantoms attempted to breach the circle, but were repelled by some invisible barrier. As their frustration mounted, the orchard itself seemed to respond. Branches whipping violently though no wind blew, roots erupting from the ground like serpents, apples falling from the trees and bursting with a sound like screams. At the height of this supernatural tumult, Morgan opened the leather-bound book to its final pages and began to read aloud, her voice cutting through the chaos with surprising clarity. The words, though in an unknown language, seemed to cause physical pain to the apparitions, who clutched at themselves as if wounded. Reverend Fleming, seeing an opportunity, stepped forward with his Bible raised. "In the name of God," he shouted, "I command you to return to your rest." What happened next remains contested. Harrison's report states that the apparitions suddenly rushed toward Fleming, passing through him in a way that caused the Reverend to collapse instantly to the ground. The 7 women, maintaining their circle, raised their voices in response. The unknown words now shouted with desperate intensity. There was a moment of absolute stillness, the trees ceasing their movement, the fallen apples halting their decay, even the night sounds of insects and animals falling silent. Then, according to all witnesses, the ground at the center of the circle split open, revealing not dirt but a swirling darkness that seemed to have depth beyond what should have been possible. The apparitions, now clearly recognizable as the Prescott sisters still hand in hand, turned toward this opening. For a moment they stood at its edge, looking back at the assembled group with expressions that Harrison could only describe as a terrible mixture of sorrow and triumph. Then, moving as one, the sisters stepped into the void, which sealed itself behind them with a sound like thunder. The trees of the orchard, so unnaturally vital just moments before, abruptly withered, their leaves blackening, their bark splitting, the crimson apples rotting instantly on the branch. As dawn broke over the orchard, the full extent of the change became apparent. Every tree had died, their trunks twisted into shapes that many found disturbing, forms that suggested human figures caught in moments of agony. The ground had turned barren, the grass withered to dust. No birds sang, no insects hummed. The orchard had become a place of absolute lifelessness. The ritual had exacted other costs as well. Reverend Fleming, though physically unharmed, never regained consciousness, remaining in a catatonic state until his death 3 years later. 3 of the 7 women who participated in the ritual developed what doctors diagnosed as nervous conditions requiring long-term institutional care. Dr. Morgan, despite having seemingly achieved her objective, burned all her notes on the case before returning to Baltimore, refusing to discuss what had transpired. Only Sheriff Harrison continued to monitor the aftermath, maintaining a watchful eye on the dead orchard and those who had been affected by its influence. The residents who had participated in the nightly vigils gradually returned to normal, their compulsions fading, the strange dreams ceasing. Children stopped collecting bones and stones, the unusual symbols disappeared from doors and windows, and the community slowly began to heal. By winter, Charles Blackwood had abandoned his property, selling it at a fraction of its value to the county, which promptly declared it unsuitable for development and established a perimeter fence with posted warnings against trespassing. The land would remain untouched for decades, a blighted patch amid the otherwise fertile countryside of Marion County. As for the Prescott sisters, their remains were never recovered, either from the cemetery where they had briefly rested or from the orchard where they had first been discovered. Their final fate remained a mystery that Harrison would ponder until his retirement in 1907. In his last entry in the case file, the sheriff wrote words that would prove unfortunately prophetic. Though the immediate threat appears to have been contained, I cannot escape the sense that we have merely interrupted something rather than ended it. The sisters are gone, but the knowledge that enabled their lingering presence remains. The book, the stones, the strange practices, these things have been seen by many and remembered. Seeds have been planted in fertile minds, and I fear what may yet grow from them. Harrison's concerns would be validated in unexpected ways in the years that followed. Throughout the early 20th century, similar cases would emerge across West Virginia and neighboring states, pairs of sisters disappearing under mysterious circumstances, only to be discovered decades later buried together, their hands clasped, often in proximity to orchards or groves. Most disturbing was the appearance of artifacts matching those found with the Prescott sisters, cloth pouches containing bones and marked stones, silver lockets with unidentified hair, and in some cases, pages apparently torn from the same leather-bound book that Dr. Morgan had used in her ritual. These cases, though investigated individually by local authorities, shared a pattern that suggested a spreading influence, a contagion of knowledge or practice that moved through communities like a whispered secret, manifesting in similar outcomes despite geographical separation. For the residents of Marion County, the Prescott case gradually transformed from recent trauma to local legend. Parents warned children to stay away from the blighted orchard land. Teenagers dared one another to venture past the perimeter fence at night. The cursed sisters became fixtures of campfire stories and regional folklore, their details embellished with each retelling. By 1925, few remained who had personally witnessed the events of that spring and summer, 20 years earlier. Those who had were often reluctant to discuss their experiences, preferring to let the past fade into obscurity. The official records, including Harrison's detailed reports and Dr. Morgan's limited documentation, were eventually relegated to the county archives, gathering dust alongside other forgotten histories. Yet something of the sisters' influence persisted. Long after the last of the witnesses had passed away, visitors to Marion County would occasionally report dreams of two young women walking hand in hand through an orchard of crimson-fruited trees, beckoning them to follow deeper among the twisted trunks. Some claimed to have woken from these dreams with the taste of apples on their tongues, a sweetness tinged with copper that reminded them inexplicably of blood. What would you do if you discovered that your family's bloodline carried a secret so dark that those who learned it often chose death over bearing its weight? In the autumn of 1945, as soldiers returned from overseas and America embraced a tentative peace, a young woman named Eleanor Blackwood made a discovery in her grandmother's attic that would unearth a generational curse thought long buried in the hills of West Virginia. While much of the nation celebrated victory and renewal, Eleanor found herself drawn into a mystery reaching back 4 decades to the infamous case of the Cursed Sisters of Marion County, a case with unexpected and intimate connections to her own family history. What began as an innocent exploration of family memorabilia would ultimately reveal truths that the small town of Fairmont had struggled to forget, and resurrect an influence that had never truly been banished. Eleanor Blackwood, 22 years of age in 1945, had returned to her grandmother's home in Fairmont following her service as a nurse in the European theatre. The only child of Charles Blackwood, Jr., she had grown up hearing fragmented stories about her grandfather's infamous orchard and the tragedy that had befallen it in the early years of the century. Like many family legends, these stories had been sanitized over time, reduced to vague warnings about bad business and unfortunate investments that had cost the Blackwoods their prominence in Marion County. Grandmother never spoke directly about what happened, Eleanor would later write in her journal. She'd go quiet whenever the old orchard was mentioned, changing the subject or suddenly remembering some pressing task. The property itself was referred to only as that place in her household, never by name or location. As a child, I sensed this boundary and learned not to cross it. But returning as an adult, having seen the horrors of war firsthand, I found my childhood fears replaced by curiosity, a dangerous trade. As it turned out, this curiosity led Eleanor to explore the long-sealed attic of her grandmother's Victorian home during a rainstorm in late September. Among dust-covered trunks and forgotten furniture, she discovered a locked cedar chest bearing the initials CB, Charles Blackwood, her grandfather. Using a hairpin to manipulate the simple lock, Eleanor opened the chest to find a collection of items carefully preserved: newspaper clippings about the discovery of the Prescott sisters, official documents regarding the orchard property, and her grandfather's personal journal from 1905. I knew immediately that I had found something significant, Eleanor recalled. The chest had been deliberately hidden away, the contents organized with care. This wasn't junk forgotten in an attic. It was evidence preserved. But for what purpose? Was grandfather attempting to document the truth or conceal it? The journal would provide unsettling answers. Beginning in January of 1905, months before the discovery of the Prescott sisters' remains, Charles Blackwood had documented increasingly disturbing observations about the family orchard. He described trees that seemed to shift position between visits, apples that ripened out of season, and most alarmingly, voices that seemed to emanate from the ground beneath certain trees, voices that Blackwood initially attributed to the wind before admitting, in later entries, that they spoke words he could almost understand.